Early 2019. The culture on Roblox at this point was largely centered around Naruto copies and anime games. There was definitely unique and non-anime projects on Roblox around this time and before this time that are critically acclaimed, but for the most part, a culture was budding on Roblox with closed community games, which were games that were restricted to a certain number of people that were invited into the game's community. And the reason being for its popularity is more than likely the developer's Snake World's project Naruto Online, which was initially created as just a game for him and his friends, I believe. You know, his friends, their friends, so on and so forth. People would get into the game through connections. And typically, things like this on the internet tend to go under the radar, but Naruto Online 2, of course, is a game that was mostly just made for friends and to be enjoyed among friends, and so it had a lack of any kind of media restriction. I doubt that any of the people on that team, despite definitely having previous projects that were pretty popular, expected this to become something of a sought after and popular experience. I'll be honest, Roblox was and always has been dry, save for a few unique creators that are making cool things. To a lot of people, Naruto Online 2 was this cool thing and they just couldn't reach it. There was no real way to play a game like this without actually having some kind of connection or way into the community. And this is the culture on Roblox that sort of jump-started a huge number of closed community games that you even still see today. So why am I talking about a Naruto game in a video about Rogue Lineage? If you're even asking this question, I'm gonna assume that you're not aware that Rogue Lineage initially got its start as one of those closed community games that had a distinct lack of media restriction. But the thing is, at this time, most of these community games were generally centered around an anime or pre-existing franchise and very rarely contained their own IP or creative direction. Rogue Lineage, however, was something fresh. And again, a lack of media restriction. I know for a fact that YouTubers like Infernasu were making videos on Rogue Lineage during its closed community phase, and this is what really started to generate a level of intrigue around this game. Most people had never seen any kind of permadeath fantasy game on Roblox whatsoever, especially a heavily PvP RPG with unique classes, artifacts, rarity systems, locations, and lore. But the truth is that Rogue Lineage was never supposed to be a game that was meant to be played by the public. Its developers, Raguzer and Archmage, never intended to make this a public game that people would pay for. Raguzer has actually gone on record multiple times saying that in podcasts that I made that are now deleted. I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry. I wish I could show you the receipts, but you're just gonna have to take my word on it for this one. But yeah, because of the hype that got generated around Rogue Lineage in its closed community phase, Rag and Arc eventually felt compelled to release the game as paid access to a public audience. But again, I'm not sure that they ever really felt that this game would take off the way that it did. But lo and behold, once it released, it generated so much buzz, so many videos, spawned new content creators, new wikis, a dedicated community, tons of players. I already said that. Fuck. Anyway, point is, it grew far beyond their expectations. And I think that this game was a key factor in motivating the team that became Monad Studios to create something of an identity, making fantasy games on Roblox that created a very dedicated and passionate community. The thing is, nobody had really seen anything like this on Roblox before. There was no talk of things like Voxel Blade, at least nothing that would be that popular. I think Rogue Lineage is the first game that really popularized things like that and inspired people to create this sort of genre of sorts on Roblox, which again, it sounds dramatic, but it really created a boom in creative and unique games coming out, and that is something that I would thank Rogue Lineage for from the bottom of my heart. So with that setup out of the way, let's get into talking about Rogue Lineage in retrospect. So I think it's fair to get started talking about the developers, Raguzer and Arc_Mage. These two were close friends during this era of closed community games. I believe that they got their start developing together as a result of Raguzer being an NO2 dev himself and being friends with Snake World. Now, Raguzer has told me in passing conversation that NO2 was technically his first start in terms of development and scripting, and working on NO2 was what inspired him to essentially learn development from the ground up, the whole process himself. I remember specifically him stating that he literally locked himself himself in his room and learned to script over the course of a few weeks. If I'm not mistaken, and I don't know, I'm not in the guy's head, but I'm pretty sure that Snake Whirl was a very large influence on Raguser and the reason he became a developer in the first place. So in a way, we have Snake Whirl, the developer of ABA of all things, to thank for Rogue Lineage. I'm pretty sure Snake Whirl and Rag are very close friends, and if you weren't aware, Snake Whirl actually had specs like his own character in Rogue Lineage that you will never see. I'm not gonna lie, that dude never played that game as far as I'm aware outside of the closed community. And by the by, just a quick little side note, if you aren't aware, the term specs refers to somebody who has unique or custom abilities made for themselves, their own character. And if that sounds unfair to you, that's because it is. Life ain't fair, buddy. All jokes aside though, this is the side of the story I have the most perspective on, but outside of that, I actually don't know much about Archmage, the co-founder of Monad Studios and pretty much lead developer currently of Deepwoken. His only previous project that I have any knowledge of or can actually reference is Tales, which was long before the time of Rogue, and honestly, I genuinely have no insight on this one whatsoever, although I do know it had a bit of a community. But what I can say I know for sure is that Tales was a fantasy game, and while it was a lot more low-key than Rogue Lineage or Deepwoken in terms of popularity and player base, what I do know for sure is that it was a fantasy game. So in a way, this is sort of the first spark that led to Rogue Lineage, the project that Rag and Ark would go on to create. And a lot of concepts and ideas from Tales are present in the Uber world of Rogue Lineage called K. So yes, I guess technically we also have Tales from the Valley and Archmage to thank for Rogue and Deepwoken. I mean, yeah, which is obvious that Archmage, but you know what? You get what I'm saying. He's the fucking co-founder and one of the lead developers, but do I even need to clarify this? Let's just get back into it, bro. I don't know what I'm talking about. So anyway, my point is though that these guys have a very long history with Roblox development and honestly just game design in general. Rag credits a lot of inspirations for some of the projects he works on. So does Archmage. In Rogue Lineage and the coming game from the would-be Monad Studios, Deepwoken, Rag and Ark cite sources like Dark Souls, Brandon Sanderson's novels such as the Stormlight Archive, Mistborn, and games like Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and I'm sure a ton of more things that I honestly couldn't know because again, I'm not in these guys' heads. But these are some of the primary inspirations for their passion for game design and creativity in general. And I think these inspirations are probably part of the reason that they took game design so seriously compared to a lot of other Roblox developers. I think it really helped normalize the idea of creating a genuine game from the ground up in Roblox. There were attempts and people did recognize the limitations of Roblox, but I think these guys are probably responsible for pushing the limits of Roblox as a platform to the extent that they did, which in turn has in the modern day inspired a lot of games on Roblox that are way more creative, way more ambitious. And say what you will about these games, I got a lot of comments of people talking about how much they hate these games, and they are sort of toxic and a little bit hard to get through, but they are hardcore. It says that in the description of both games, you know? And the thing is, these developers fully recognize that the games that they create aren't for everyone, and I think that's what makes them so ambitious as creators and developers, that they're willing to take risks like adapting roguelike elements or adapting permadeath and fantasy and deep in-depth lore and all kinds of world building and environmental storytelling into their games that nobody really likes to do on Roblox or liked to do. And I think we can really thank these two's love for game design and creating games, their faith in Roblox, I guess, as a platform in order to push it to the limits that they did, for a lot of the advancements that have been made on Roblox today. The truth is, before they proved that you could do it with enough skill at coding and scripting, nobody was ambitious enough to attempt anything like Deepwoken on Roblox before it became a thing. And Rogue Lineage, the subject of this video, was what sparked that level of development, I guess. If you can't tell, I have a lot of respect for these two people. They're fucking insane. They're butt fucking insane, but they're also very hard workers, very passionate about game design, and very skilled at what they do. I view Rag as the creative driving force behind the projects that Monad Studios is responsible for, and I view Archmage as the person who basically made all of these things possible to do and genuinely kind of normal on Roblox. The consensus before these games were made and popularized was that things like that are just not possible on Roblox. And Rogue Lineage was pretty much their first foray into pushing those limits and telling those people that are doubting that this is even possible to do on a platform like Roblox to fuck off. There's really no better way to put it. These guys were crazy enough to look at the front page of Roblox, see shit like fucking, I don't know, lift weights simulator or like death cart ride from Homer Simpson and be like, this is the platform where I'm going to create my highest form of art that I could possibly conceive. Like I said, they were butt fucking insane. I've said it twice, dude. It's crazy to me. I don't think that really gets enough credit. But yeah, okay, enough about the developers. And I know that this is a long section, but this is going to be a long video, as I'm sure you know after clicking onto it. So just bear with me. So on release, the thing that really drew people into playing Rogue Lineage and continuing to enjoy it is honestly just the exploration and the community aspect. Now, if you ask me, Rogue Lineage is the only game that started as a community-based game and continued to be a community-based game even after its public release. The thing is, teamwork was honestly required in a game like Rogue Lineage, at least in its infancy, because nobody knew anything, so you needed people to rely on to help you learn things. Sure, there would be wikis and guides and things like that on YouTube in the future, but for the most part, if you weren't playing in a house, you were hoed, unless your name is like Reevolu or something. But yeah, save for like Iron Man challenges and things like that, for the most part, it was a team-driven game. It was a community-driven game because people wanted to be that house that people knew. And there were houses like that. I guess I should explain what a house is. So because Rogue Lineage was built from the ground up to be a community-driven game and then released to the public, they had a feature that really served the community aspect well called houses. And what houses were was a person could become the lord of their own house for, I think it was a cost of silver or something, which allowed them to create their own house name, house emblem, and it would become a part of their last name. So on the server list, you would see these people based on what their house was, and you might be able to recognize them based on their influence over the game. And much like an MMO, you had to be invited to these houses in order to join them, so most of the time it was tight-knit houses, groups of friends, people that they knew, that got invited. Now there were houses that did like recruiting and stuff like that, and some houses got really cringe, like Malkavian and a bunch of houses. Malkavian, Haru, I could think of a few others if I wasn't geriatric and this wasn't 10 years ago. Not 10 years ago, alright, chill, I'm not that unk, but let me let me get to the point. Point is though, people would hold like tryouts and things like that. Like people took this stuff so seriously. And I think that was what was part of what made this game so special. It really drove you to take it seriously. It had serious lore, serious environmental storytelling, things like that. And it made you want to feel like you were a part of it, you know, like a part of the world. Maybe that's just me and my nostalgia, but I mean, you know, like that's how it was for me. Some people probably just, they low-key like ruining people's days and fucking people up. That's okay too. There's some beauty in that as well. But yeah, so the game's progression was difficult, so it wasn't easy to progress alone, and these houses made it a lot easier because if you had friends, big groups of people to play with, you could genuinely gank people, like fuck people up, and that was low-key the main appeal of Rogue Lineage, was you progress and you fight other houses for glory. It was just glory points back then. Not to say that the game didn't encourage PvP, because the progression itself was actually based around PvP as well. You needed to get experience in order to be eligible for your classes and your skills and stuff by punching people, beating people up, and there was an alignment system, which is now being used in like tons of games. But this alignment system basically was pretty simple. If you wanted to go the chaotic route of killing people and being a bad guy, you would have to go run around and kill people. You could take assassination contracts for a higher yield of chaotic points, I suppose. Or if you were on the orderly side, what you had to do was, there was no other option. You can't just kill people, right? So it was a little harder, but you had to find people who were chaotic and then take them to jail. And this game had a permadeath mechanic, so after a certain number of deaths, your character was permanently deleted no matter how much progression you had. And in Rogue Lineage in particular, when compared to Deepwoken, there was no form of permanent progression per se. There used to be, and there kind of is now with edicts and such, but back then that didn't exist, and there was literally nothing you could do after your character got wiped other than maybe spend 1,000 Robux. We won't talk about that, you know. You gotta get your bag. Monetization is important. But even still, you could only do it once, so this game really wanted to maintain its hardcore permadeath identity. And in the first days, resources were limited. Everybody had to find things, and things were so out of the way, obscure, and a little bit difficult to find, complex. There were quests and such to achieve certain classes that you had to do, that honestly low-key took some trial and error if you weren't looking at a wiki or something, you know, if you didn't have the actual source of like how to get these things. And the majority of these classes required you to take risks in progression because you needed the PvP, you needed to do dangerous quests to get your ultra classes and stuff like that. And of course there was XP and alignment, which you had to do by killing people or jailing people, like I said. So this all led to this game feeling like an actual like bout for survival, you know what I mean? At least in theory, because eventually there was sort of a loophole in the progression that people found. Honestly, there were lots of loopholes. Aside from like training your mana and getting mana, obtaining mana, I guess, you could pretty much cheese the progression by using an alternate account, which is what most people did. And there's only so much you can do about this. I mean, this is the problem with gaming in general. You know, people will create Smurf accounts. It doesn't matter if the game costs money. If they think that they get an easier barrier to progression by purchasing a new account, people will do it. And there's really not a good way to combat against that. And believe me, the devs did their best, but eventually they gave up on trying to stop alt farming. It was just a part of the game at some point. I think this is probably one of Rogue Lineage's major flaws, is that the progression was so tedious and difficult to do that it became more convenient to farm alts. If you ask me, what I would have done in their position at this time was just make the progression easier in order to stop people from doing that. Yes, it does make the game a little less hardcore when you don't have to spend a lot of time searching for people that had a specific alignment that you were trying to track if you were orderly, or spend a lot of time going out and fighting people that may just fucking kill you because they're better than you or whatever. You know, most people would just default to these things because people take the path of least resistance in games like these. And like I said, in my opinion, I think the best way to alleviate that would have probably been to just make the path of least resistance the actual method of progression that was intended for the game. But like I said, this game started as a closed community game, so alts, they just weren't a problem for them in closed community because you were able to have one account in the game. You had to be invited on an account in order to join, and there's no fucking way you can convince them to let your other account in. You know what I mean? But even still, with this easier progression that people were doing, it didn't really change the fact that the game was still pretty hardcore. Like, you could die, you could lose lives, and you could wipe in some of the craziest ways possible. Man, I could not tell you how many stories, dude. There is a clip that I had on this channel from way back when where I was a cameo, which is an artifact race. Yo, I'm gonna get into artifacts a little bit later, but basically they have 9 lives and they deplete their lives as they fight, but they don't go down, they keep fighting. So what I had did was I was on 1 life from a fight. I had accidentally combat logged, so I started at 1 HP and I jumped off of the top of this thing on Orsfall and I fucking died. I wiped. So yeah, you know what I'm saying? This is a bad example because I'm fucking retarded. But like, you know, shit like this could happen, you know what I mean? Shit happens in games like these. Anyway, besides the point, I'm sure you get it now. Cause yeah, the progression may have been a little bit flawed, but while the game's progression may have been flawed in this way, there were certain things about the progression that honestly just couldn't be cheesed. And it was things like that that honestly kept the game alive for me and probably for most people. Some of these quests were really fun and really well designed, and they felt cool as shit to do. When it was still fresh and new to get an ultra class, the feeling that you got watching like your guildmates or whatever the fuck that were around you when you got your ultra class, they saw you do it and succeed with this quest, you felt like you had so much aura, bro. You were just standing over them like, I am the ultra. Does that make sense? Like, look, it sounds cringe, but like, it's really the feeling that this game gave. Which is why, despite these flaws that I mentioned in its progression, this game still popped off super hard. And in addition to there being these really fun and engaging quests to actually complete your ultra class, there was also something that you really couldn't cheese because it was just pure RNG. Unless you were an exploiter, there was no way to cheese it. Artifacts. They were exceedingly rare, but they were items that you could find in specifically like dangerous areas where they had higher rates. I mean, you technically could find them anywhere, but the rates are so insanely low. Point is though, these artifacts gave you insane buffs. I'm gonna list a few just to give you a general idea. The one that I was talking about earlier was the White King's Amulet. The way that it worked was you had to sacrifice 4 people in order to get this cameo race. While holding this White King's Amulet, you would basically absorb their souls, I think insta-wipe them, if I'm not mistaken, and it would give you this race called Cameo, where you had up to 9 lives and you could just fight. You had 1,000,000 health bars. You felt like a literal boss. This was my favorite artifact in the game. It was so fun to play with, and it was my main, you know, that was my identity. Back then, I was an Abyss Walker cameo. You might call me brain dead, I don't care. It was so fun. There was also the Lannis Amulet, which was another type of amulet. I know, just listen to amulets. They're the easiest ones to remember, honestly. But the Lannis Amulet basically made you immune to any magic of any kind. So if you got hit with a magical spell, which did exist in this game, you would just phase out of reality and you would get like iframes for a time. There were some sorrier artifacts like Howler Friend, which just made some of the mobs in the game that were honestly only in specific areas and not attack you. That shit was ass. They should have deleted it. But there was also really insane ones like Phoenix Feather, which lets you heal as you charge your mana. Literally heal. So yeah, you could see how much of an impact these would have on your progression, and them being so rare made it feel like an oh shit moment once you found somebody who had one of these artifacts. And then there were the mage class specific artifacts, which people referred to as god spells, things like Fimbulvetter, Snarvender. I think there was one called Percutions or something like that. But what they were is they were very powerful spells that were rare to obtain, maybe a little less rarer than most of the other artifacts, but they were still very powerful. And honestly, it was another oh shit moment when you fought somebody with something like this. And I'm sure that you can see or imagine how much this plays into the already existing community aspect of like basically trying to achieve a level of progression over everybody else. It got super addicting and it felt so fulfilling and rewarding to actually achieve these heights of progression, especially back then when it was difficult and nobody really knew anything. Granted, it was pretty fast when people started to learn everything, you know, and post it on the internet, post guide videos, whatever. That's just the nature of it now being a public game, but the magic was still there, you know what I mean? It felt some type of way to do these things. And if you're starting to see the appeal now, I'm sure that that's what everybody else was thinking. And of course, still in its early days, there were talks of content updates now that this game was making them a lot of money and honestly providing them with a living. They now had this motivation to try to lift this game to a higher state. And among other content updates, this was eventually what led to one of the most controversial and hated updates of the game, which I have to talk about in a retrospective video. Just is what it is. It was called K, and what it was is once you achieved your ultra class and the type of progression that you'd like, you had the chance to go find this thing called, I think it was Yiselda. It gave you this sick ass dialogue, you had to speak with it, and it basically transported you to another dimension of the game in which you could achieve an even higher level of progression called an Uber class. Now, this was their way of keeping the scaling in check, because once you got into K as an ultra class, you were sorry. You were basically back to square one. It was like being a base class again. Anybody who had an Uber was going to fuck your shit up. That is how high these scaled over the other classes. And this being at this high of a scale was problematic if they were to keep it in the same world. So it going to a different dimension was how they balanced this and made it a little bit more reasonable. And I'm sure this sounds very cool to you in theory, but sadly, the initial release of this update flopped pretty hard. It received a lot of very valid criticism as this update ended up being sort of rushed. The map was low-key, kind of ugly. The progression wasn't anywhere near as fun. It was just twice as tedious, and the Uber classes were kind of cool, sure, but they needed some balance changes. They needed some major changes because a lot of them just weren't good, and a lot of them just didn't feel as good as the other Uber classes. So eventually, they decided to scrap everything that existed in this version of the K update because of how badly it was received. But you know what? In my opinion, this was a great teaching experience for them that definitely carried into their next games, because they did something that honestly most devs probably wouldn't do. If you release this update that took like months of just straight hard work, well, I say months, they did rush it. I think they've even said that themselves, that they really just wanted to rush this thing out, but they went back to the drawing board and they completely re-envisioned this update, which eventually led to overhauls of existing classes, overhauls of the world, the quests, everything that was in the actual update basically got changed from the ground up. So this K update, which is called Update Ultimate, which I just literally forgot until right now, so I'm mentioning it now. It didn't really feel like an Update Ultimate at first, but after the revamps and the reworks and the changes they made to it, this update was cool. I personally was a huge fan of it. I didn't end up playing in K as much, and honestly, if you go into the main game, that shit is dead. Like, you're not gonna find many people there. But at the time of the update's release, I think it's actually probably where I made some of the fondest memories of my time playing Rogue Lineage, and it really just made for a fun experience all around. Sadly, it is dead now, and its time is over. I accept that, but I do kind of wish that it had kind of gotten a little more love going forward. But still, these updates were what they were and are what they are. And if you ask me, this was probably the only real logical leap forward they could have taken. Before this update, the only thing they could really do was add more ultra classes, and that was all well and good, but it didn't really make the game feel fresh enough. And frankly, this is really the best way they could have gone. So in my opinion, despite the controversy surrounding the update, and despite the fact that most people really didn't enjoy it as much as the actual main game, which was called Gaia, this update was still technically pretty impressive and honestly very fun when you just boil it down to its most basic aspect. Were there balance issues? Of course. How do you balance making people extremely powerful and just throwing balance out the window for the sake of making the classes more fun? And honestly, some games need something like that. Rogue Lineage was one of them. But like all things, people eventually grew tired of this update as well. And the result of that was the game that now lives in infamy on this channel, on the Roblox platform, on YouTube in general. Project Drown Gods, which was announced a few months after the update slowly started to die out. And sadly, this is more or less where Rogue Lineage's story ends. The game does still receive seasonal updates and things like that. A few new classes have been added since the release of Deepwoken, which was originally called Drowned Gods, which is why I called it that. Yeah, anyway, with the project now still being at least regularly updated by Grimkind, who took over as basically the lead developer of Rogue Lineage, the game basically saw its last echoes of existence, and while still, it did receive sometimes anywhere from 1 to like 5,000 players at some times during its most bustling moments of people returning to it for the sake of nostalgia or whatever it may be. The game was pretty much over. But that shouldn't understate the influence that it had on Roblox as a platform, which I've already yapped about to a great extent. So I just wanted to use this as a conclusion statement that at the end of the day, if it weren't for Rogue and the things that it had become, I don't know where I'd be right now. I don't know where Roblox would be right now, but I think I can safely say that I prefer this timeline. Anyway, though, I think that's all I got to talk about. This was a long one, but I hope you enjoyed. And if you like content like this, if you like my videos, subscribe. And oh, I gotta shill. Go check out my new channel, Red Pedal TV, please, bro. I love that channel. I've been working really hard on it. And if you really like nostalgia gaming, like the golden era of gaming, it's low-key what I've been focusing on the most on that channel, and also like media critique and stuff like that. But yeah, go check that out. And yeah, thank you. Anyway, that's it. Bye-bye.